Hello again. Today we shall make another video. Now, admittedly, it's rather late for me, and probably for you as well if you're anywhere past, about the time zone for Iowa, if we're being honest. So anyways, today I want to talk about the story of the Civil War and some context behind it. Now, maybe a bit hard to see, but I'll try my best to adjust. Anyways, so for starters, let's get the lost cause out the way. The Civil War was fought over slavery. That wasn't the only grievance, but that was the main one, and I have proof because I've had arguments with secessionists before, and so I decided to compile all the secession papers, well, 5 of them actually, and I decided to highlight a few things. Hope you don't mind me reading this. Georgia. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. They have endeavored to weaken our security, to disturb our domestic peace and tranquility, and persistently refuse to comply with their express constitutional obligations to us in reference to that property, and by the use of their power in the federal government have striven to deprive us of an equal enjoyment of the common territories of the Republic. Furthermore, they add a brief history of the rise, progress, and policy of anti-slavery and the political organization into whose hands the administration of the federal government has been committed will fully justify the pronounced verdict of the people of Georgia. The party of Lincoln, called the Republican Party, under its present name and organization, is of recent origin. It is admitted to be an anti-slavery party. Anti-slavery is its mission and its purpose. By anti-slavery, it is made a power in the state. While the subordination and the political and social inequality of the African race was fully conceded by all, it was plainly apparent that slavery would soon disappear from what are now the non-slaveholding states of the original 13. The opposition to slavery was then, as now, general in those states, and the Constitution was made with direct reference to that fact. But a distinct abolition party was not formed in the United States for more than half a century after the government went into operation. They have many more articles similar. To go to another state, the whole doc goes on for 47 pages. And here's Mississippi. Opposition is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. These products are peculiar to the climate, said products being the result of slaves, are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. They list many grievances, including advocating, quote, Negro equality socially and politically, and promotes insurrection and incendiarism in our midst. I'll get to the bit there. There's also South Carolina. But in deference to the opinions and wishes of the other slaveholding states, she forbore at that time to exercise this rights. Since that time, these encroachments have continued to increase, and further forbearance ceases to be a virtue. An increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the law of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. So on and so forth. Now there's Texas. She was received as a commonwealth. Let me make sure I get it right. She was conceived as a commonwealth holding, maintaining, and protecting the institution known as, quote, Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that had existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, in which her people intended should exist in all future time. That was Texas. Virginia. Keep in mind, Virginia is Jefferson's home, so. Yeah. Also, small thing about the Confederate their constitution, they make explicitly clear in their constitution, and I quote, "No bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed." Yeah, they made it very clear. Slavery was definitely a big part, if not the part, of the Civil War and its justifications. Now, how did we get to a point where states were so intertwined with the institution of slavery, specifically their politicians and leaders, to the point that they were willing to fight a war over it? Well, let's start with the backstory, shall we? So, starting, let's say, with the 13 colonies. Let's go back to the 13 colonies as of independence. Now, the drawing will be very roughshod and won't be that good, but I'll try. Okay, let's try to pretend like this is a good drawing. Oh, who am I kidding? It ain't. But let's say that this is a good drawing of the 13 colonies. Now, when we first learn about it, generally speaking, we break it up into the northern states, best described as New England, the central states, so like New York, Pennsylvania, and all the way down to Maryland, and then we have the southern states, so these guys down here. Now, it's important to note that cash crops have always been a big thing in the South during this time, from this time to later. In the colonial period, it was originally tobacco, but they didn't use slaves at first. No. What they used were indentured servants. What this meant was you would contract yourself out, put yourself in debt, usually to go over to the New World, and you would act as a servant for however long that would be to pay off your debt. You would effectively sell yourself into service. Now, it's not quite the same thing as slavery, just like serfdom, but it was a type of labor law that was not exactly the best for those who suffered under it. Now, at the time, the southern governments rewarded people more land for giving out these indentures to people wishing to come over. But eventually, people who were indentured got tired of the southern governments and the planters, especially because they didn't crack down as much on the native resistance to the west, and because they weren't getting as much land, because some southern people would actually give out land to their indentured servants once they would no longer serve them. Stop doing that, so a man by the name of Bacon led a rebellion. It was crushed, and slavery started to be the dominant form of labor in the South. This characterizes a lot of the South's relation with slavery among the lower classes. Because while it doesn't really matter what the lower classes thought of slavery even in the South, because they're not the ones making the laws, it does matter to characterize why so many will be willing to still fight other than other causes. Because for several people in the South, even in the lower classes, there was a very real justification to keep fighting even if they believed it was for slavery, because it gave them some status. A lot of what the South did was going to the lower class Southerners, and the planters would say to them, "Alright, you, I understand you're pretty poor and you're not that well off, but hey, you're better than him, you know that black guy over there? Yeah, he's inferior to you, you're better than him, so stick with me, support my causes, he won't be a challenge to you and your jobs, so you can be fine, he'll just be the one suffering and we can work together, okay?" That's a lot of what the South did with the lower classes, because the worry was, even for some Northerners, well, if we free the slaves, they may come up and take our jobs. The Southern planters exploited that weakness, especially among the poor Southerners. Now then, let's speed up time. So, minor border changing here, thanks to Webster Ashburn. And then out west do we go. And then, as the territories expanded, Webster Ashburn wouldn't happen till the 1830s, but good to just get it done now. As the West was expanding, you had several people discuss, well, how should the states look? The initial belief was to sanction off the new territories, mostly for new states. Now, that wasn't completely the case. For example, New York and Pennsylvania cut off a good chunk of the westward land that they took past Appalachia. But most of the territory was, well, new, and so it was carved up into territories, such as the Northwest Territory. Not exact, but this should be a good way to demonstrate. Like, this territory over here was made into a non-slave place. It was actually forbidden for you to have slaves here. Now, that was not the case down south. Several states, like Georgia, for example, took their own chunks of land, but much of this area, which makes up modern-day Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi and Alabama, actually, I believe Mississippi is a bit further on, but much of this land was open to slavery. I correct myself there. Slave place. And so what we end up seeing over time is, for the South especially, due to the nature of slavery, expansion of it became a big deal and a big factor in policy. Because slavery is, I don't know if you know this, a very bad economic system. Now, the King Cotton defense may get to a few people, but it's simply not the case. You see, slave labor has a lot of issues, most notably poor incentives, but also the fact that a piece of equipment, because they viewed them as such, that wants to constantly leave you, needs to be replaced, needs to be constantly guarded, and other such things, is not a good piece of equipment to have. It's better to have a machine that can be let go and can do what it's going to do regardless. Or, if you're going to have something that needs to think for itself, have low-wage workers. Or, honestly, just any wage worker. And so, there's a reason we see during the Gilded Age, even though African Americans weren't as well treated, they still got a better lot and the economy improved overall. Because the more people can participate in the economy freely, the better. But what this matters for the South is, after independence, their way of growing their economies, specifically the Southern planters, was to keep pushing west. Now, Manifest Destiny, in its many forms, was a big deal for most of American society. One of our grievances with King George, I shouldn't really say King George, that's just who he blamed, truthfully it was on Parliament, but it was this Appalachian Ordinance that said we were not allowed to go past those mountains, and that was native land. Well, guess what? A lot of Americans wanted to go past and settle the area, so they tried to push. But for the South especially, they wanted the tropical land so that they could spread slavery, because that's how they made money, especially for people, I'm not going to draw this good, but especially for people here in South Carolina. South Carolina, also known as the home of the Fire Eaters. Now, the Fire Eaters are rather known for a number of things, but their main one was pro-slavery politics. They were the big profiters from the slave economy and were some of the richest of the rich when it came to slavers. And so, as the nation went on, slowly expanding, and I say slowly, it wasn't that slow really, but as expansion continued, we found some issues. Most notably, over here. Texas was alright. It was one of the last decent-sized slave states. But it had a big issue. It was the last of the main slave states. Because all this territory over here that would become the New Mexico territory, pretty useless. It was largely desert, and so it was hard to spread slavery there. Now, there was some who tried to push slavery to California, but it didn't really work out well, mainly because California, thanks to the gold rush, became a free state. But as slavery spread, going out, expanding over Missouri, and into Oklahoma, of course taking over Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, so on and so forth, there became a big issue. See, when you have slavery as your main economic system, you need to constantly expand, both for more slaves and more land for the slaves. We couldn't import slaves, so often breeding programs were enacted. And yes, they are as disgusting as you can imagine. But with this comes an inherent conflict. See, the North wanted to expand too, expanding this land that didn't allow slavery out as well. This led to a number of things, including disputes over areas like Kansas and Nebraska, specifically Kansas, because it was on the border of the two areas. But also, it led to proposals like the Ostend Manifesto, which said that Cuba should be taken over by the South and turned into a slave state. Now, I'm not exactly someone who is opposed to expansion under most circumstances, but really? You want Cuba for slavery? I don't think that's a very good idea. Those guys seem annoying, especially when it comes to things like slavery and capitalism, just general ideology. But regardless, the South said, hey, we should take over Cuba, expand slavery. And besides the discount Golden Circle not being the best idea, especially considering they were trying to fight Spain, not at the best of times, because the U.S. was still a growing power. Now, Spain had collapsed, but still, it's not a very good fight to pick, especially with relations with Britain being at a pretty low time, given the whole Oregon dispute going on over here. 36-30 a fight, by the way. Hate that we had to give up any land, but good times. But, as you can see here, with this constant push for expansion in the North and the South, there was already a lot of competition. Another big deal was over here, in Hispaniola. You might have heard of it. It was called the Haitian Revolution. Now, the Haitians did conquer the Dominican Republic for a time, or rather the Spanish Hispaniola, but eventually it broke free. And the thing that is bad about Haiti in reference to the South is what they did to their white people. Haiti, due to their history with the French and also the fact that the French sent to suppress the Haitian rebellion committed many atrocities, responded with atrocities in return. Straight up banning being white in Haiti. Yeah, they straight up banned being a white person in an island. Now, cruel as it is, it was even worse in terms of its effect on the South, because for the South, imagine what you're thinking when you look down here. Now, the Haitian Revolution was quite a few years past the Texas annexation, but even during that time, imagine what you must be thinking if the first successful slave rebellion in history, and what do? They slaughter every man, woman, and child of a certain skin color. Your skin color. Especially because they associated it with slavery. Now, if you're a planter, that's terrifying because you're the first target. Even if you're the wife of a planter who likely is tied to it, or a child who doesn't know what's going on but does know they don't want to die. And for the lower class whites, what they hear is, wait, those guys over there killed people just for their skin color? I'm not skin color. Oh, freak. So the idea of the slaves having independence was heavily associated with Haiti and the brutality that came with the Haitian Revolution. Needless to say, it made the South very, very hesitant to ban slavery. Now, if this were the past, remember the 1800s, start of the 1800s with Jefferson, maybe you could have enacted a law that slowly abolished slavery with compensated emancipation. There it is. Giving money to slavers in exchange for freeing their slaves and slowly but surely phasing it out. Early 1800s, possible? Unlikely, heavily unlikely, but it's theoretically possible. By the 1810s and 20s, that was not happening, especially after Haiti. Haiti so terrified the South during the antebellum period, they were not taking a single chance. They should have banned black people being able to read, because they were that scared of what would happen if blacks got any ideas. To say that it caused a mass panic in the South would be an understatement. Now, were there ways to avoid this? Yeah, slowly freeing the slaves, being kind to them, making sure that they don't have any ideas, and basically slowly but surely abolishing things themselves. But people don't think rationally, especially when their life is on the line. And if this is the only way you know how to run an economy, how to run a household, that's what you're gonna do. It's just kind of how things work. And so, in their very human way, the South was so panicked by the possibility of another Haiti happening that any prospect of black people getting any semblance of freedom was off the table immediately. And then Lincoln wins the election. Now, a lot of people will say, well, Lincoln didn't really want to free the slaves that badly. And fair enough, he was far more moderate when it came to abolitionist policy, or rather anti-slavery policy. Abolitionist is reserved mainly for those who wanted to abolish slavery immediately. But, despite being a fairly moderate person in the Republican Party, he was still not a fan of slavery and wanted to enact a proviso which would ban slavery in the territories. I believe it was called the Wilmot Proviso, and it wanted to ban all territories gained in the Mexican Cession, our territory we took from Mexico, having slavery. Now, this idea of basically boxing in slavery so that it would die a slow death was not something the South was willing to accept. Because they knew, you stop expansion, guess what? Slavery's gonna die slowly, so it's better to start things now. Another thing to note is, inside the Republican Party, sure there were moderates like Lincoln, there was also Thaddeus Stevens. And the man that Muhammad Ali was initially named after, Cassius Marcellus Clay. The extremist Republicans were the worry for the Democrats in the South. When they saw Lincoln, they saw Thaddeus Stevens and Cassius Clay behind him. They were taking no chances. Because even if Lincoln truly was a moderate and didn't try to outright ban slavery during his term, that doesn't matter when Cassius Clay and Thaddeus Stevens are knocking at the door trying to get a Republican coalition to stop banning slavery. And they certainly were not above doing it. And so, the Southern planters, recognizing the position they were in, voted to secede from the Union. Now, the politicians were not all Southern planters, but the vast majority were, and those who weren't had ties to them, because those were the ones with power in the South. It was the Southern planters. As much as people like to think of the Jeffersonians as a big player in Southern politics, at this point, by the Civil War, they really weren't. It was the Jacksonians and the Fire Eaters that carried the most baggage, that carried the most weight and influence in the South. Jackson, for being an agrarian populist, gained much support, especially in the rural areas and the northern parts of the South, places like Tennessee and the like. In the Deep South, though, it was the Fire Eaters. I'm trying to remember who it was. He was the one who tried to make the South Carolina secede under Jackson. He was the big leader of the Fire Eaters. In fact, actually, I'm going to look him up real quick. There it is, sorry I forgot. Especially after playing Victoria 3 for so long. It was John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun and his Fire Eaters carried much of the influence in the Deep South because they really spoke to planter politics. So for the agrarians and the farmers living out on their homesteads, those yeomen, as many of English descent might call them, it was largely Jackson and his ideas of expanding the country, going out, claiming more land for the pioneer to settle, that really appealed to them and their sensibilities. And for the Southern planters, it was the Fire Eaters like Calhoun that really appealed to them. Because here they said, well, what they were all thinking, we're superior, we deserve to have these slaves, and we should keep them. Now, Jackson didn't object to slavery, but it didn't really matter regardless. Because those who cared about slavery, well, they were either going to go against it or they were saying, hey, this Calhoun guy's got a point. And so the Jacksonians and the Fire Eaters united, and eventually, the Civil War occurred. Now, the Civil War was not a fun time, frankly. I would say calling it anything other than a proof of why some places need to burn would be rather underselling it. The fact was, the war was brutal for everyone. In the North, there were constant Southern raids, especially after failed Union offensives. And in the South, well, let's see, you got a naval blockade by one of the best navies at the time. You have constant raids from cavalry, because that was just how things were done at the time. You have Grant knocking down your freaking doors in the Mississippi, trying to cut the place in half. And if you're in Virginia, you have constant Union armies trying to take Richmond. That's full of good reasons to not have a good time. And this is all ignoring the fact that if you were a Southerner at the time that was black, you were a slave and you were being treated like garbage. So basically everyone in the South was not having a good time. Frankly, for which reason, they got off mercifully. But regardless, for everyone involved, the Civil War wasn't fun. No, that's an understatement. But regardless, what came out of it was Reconstruction. And what we see, both during the Civil War and Reconstruction, is that authoritarianism became the thing of the day. Because when you get down to it, when you're facing a massive military threat, acting very militantly is often the only way to really get through with any efficiency. So the South brought upon itself more tyranny than it cares to admit. Martial law was enacted in many states, southern and northern. Bayonet point was often used to seize territory and also used to seize provisions, because living off the land half the time just meant pillaging local farmsteads. Of course, there was also the suspension of habeas corpus and a number of civil liberties by both the Lincoln and... not Lee. Why did I forget his name? Davis, there it is. Jefferson Davis. And the Davis administration. Both sides, they inflicted numerous tyrannies against the people of both sides. You were not spared from Davis being a piece of garbage just because you were in the South. No, you spared from it if you were in the North, if you were hoping that Lincoln would be kind to you. Fact is, that's how you win a war. Authoritarianism. Now, it may not be pretty and it may not always be required, but it is the most efficient way, especially when you're dealing with a massive civil disturbance. And so, clashes became the norm, especially during Reconstruction. For as messy as the Civil War is, it's worth talking about Reconstruction because that mess continued. Now, as tyrannical as Lincoln was to try to crush the war, the tyranny that came about during Reconstruction was just a freaking disgrace on both sides. For one, Lincoln was actually preferred when it came to Reconstruction because he was, as many will point out, a moderate. He was not a radical Reconstructionist who was about to seize 40 acres and a mule just to hand out to people. So for the Southern planters, Lincoln was a good choice to preserve a lot of their property, minus the slaves, and just their general stance in society. It was the radicals like Grant that they feared, those veterans of that war who had such a lingering hatred of the South after all the blood that was spilt over what they considered to be a crime against humanity. It certainly didn't help that the South's reaction was straight-up terrorism. The Ku Klux was notorious for murdering black people and suppressing freedmen from engaging in their newfound rights and liberties. Now, there was a lot of ties to Canada during this time, for especially African Americans, but the big thing in the Union was, of course, where to go now. Now, Reconstruction led to a number of things. For one, it led to the Gilded Age, and also Republican dominance for many, many years, which meant high tariffs and lax regulatory engagement over the market. But it also led to radical Reconstruction, an attempt to basically make the South from the ground up. It didn't work, for a number of reasons. For one, they were hamstrung by the South and people's desires of just getting it over with. Reintegrate the states, we're done with the fighting. For another, the South was making it living heck to be down there. The KKK and other paramilitary groups were making it annoying to be black, well, pretty much anywhere. Jim Crow laws were being introduced, and the fact is, military force in the area was often very difficult unless you wanted to get shot at. Basically, nothing was going well following the Civil War. Now, all that being said, was freeing the slaves the right thing to do, given what it cost? Yes, unequivocally, yes. I'm not even going to pretend. Abolishing it was just a good thing to do, especially from an economic standpoint. Plus, they pay taxes, so the government got a big benefit as well. You know, it really shouldn't be my first instinct to say, they pay taxes now to justify ending slavery, but, well, it helps. And when dealing with the government, hey, more taxpayers is better. But yeah, it was a good thing that the slaves are freed. Would I prefer if less blood had to be spilled over it? Would I have preferred for the South to voluntarily abolish the slavery and then start homesteading the land instead of just building giant plantations? Yes, I would have. I would freaking love that. But did that happen? No. Do we have to understand things as they happened? Yes. Frankly, the South is lucky they didn't get burned for the treason they committed against both their country and nature, but they're around now, and it's been a few centuries. I think we can cut them at least the burnings. And so, Dixie and Yankee eventually had to go around and agree to stop being pieces of garbage. Well, completely. Jim Crow laws existed throughout the entire country. It wasn't just the South. And there were major problems going throughout the country following Reconstruction that were lingering from this civil disturbance. This not worthless, but truly tragic spilling of blood. It certainly didn't help that the Native Americans decided to back the South. So a lot of Northern commanders looked at the Indians as basically traitors. Yeah, that definitely didn't help their reputation when it came to the Indian Wars. Especially the Cherokee. Those guys did not have a good time. And now, as we look over the history, there's one thing we can say. It happened, and we have to examine it as it did. At the same time, we must move on. What honestly is the point of clinging around to old maps and dead bodies that aren't going to do anything anymore? They fed the dirt already. Now we're standing above them, above millions if not billions of other corpses. But that doesn't change the fact that the present is the present. We are no longer tied, or at least required to be tied, to this old situation. We should move forwards. In the end, Yankee and Dixie were still brothers. We're also brothers with the Candies, or as they like to call themselves, Canucks. But, you know, Britain decided to be a bit more of a butt with them, so they got to stay out of this great union. Anyways, I hope you have a good day. Sorry if my statements and just general rant weren't that extensive, but I hope you enjoyed. Have a good one, and goodbye.